Thank you. So before I begin, I just want to say there are a lot of people to thank. Some of them are in this room. I mean, this was a tremendous undertaking. So I just want to say how grateful I am to be here. Yeah, so, and especially the people in my department for all the support when this was happening, especially with the index, which was oddly the most fun, well, not the most fun, but the most recent challenge, yeah, with the publication process. So my goal for today, I just want to introduce some definitions. I want to tell everybody what the word Anthropocene means, if you're wondering. I also want to review my argument and then sort of go over what I'm arguing in a few of my chapters. So my first question, to open this up a little bit, is what is the Anthropocene? Has anybody heard this word before? Does anybody have a definition? Yeah.
It's the most recent time period in the geologic timescale.
Okay. And do you know why geologists have started to sort of, yeah, because initially it was called the Holocene, right? And recently they've introduced this new term, which you can see has that root anthro. Do you know why they've sort of changed it? Or
the human impact on our environment.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's not a plant, okay?
No, that was great. That was great. Yeah, so it names the geological epoch in which we're living, where humans have gained geologic agency and influence over the Earth's climate and environment without necessarily meaning to. It's not like we intended to kind of be where we are here with this. Whoops. When I introduce this to students, I like to just show them some numbers and have them keep some of these numbers in mind. So 2 meters equals 187 million, 150 a day, 7.8, and 409.8. And what these mean are that by the year 2100, 2 meters of sea level rise is going to displace 187 million people. This is the one that really boggles my mind when I think about it, that 150 species go extinct every day. And that's, again, that's because of human behaviors. By the year 2100, the oceans are going to have a pH level of 7.8, down from 8.1. And this is a little dated at this point, but 409.8 parts per million is the global atmospheric carbon dioxide average. Again, from a few years ago at this point, which is the highest it's been in 3 million years. The acidity of the ocean is obviously hurting a lot of marine life, but it's also creating sort of a party for jellyfish. So again, if this trend continues, we're gonna have seas full of jellyfish. And again, I like this graphic because it sort of identifies where the Anthropocene sort of fits in the history of the world. Again, it's an epoch, a geological epoch. And the thing about identifying a new geological epoch, as a geologist would tell you, is that it has to be legible in the rock record, right? So to move from the Cretaceous or from the Mesozoic era to the Cenozoic era, you have a meteor striking, and sort of life kind of has to start over on planet Earth, right? So the question becomes, what is the thing that actually indicates a change from talking about the Holocene or moving into the Anthropocene? And when does this epoch actually start? So scientists debate this, right? You could take 12,000 BC, the agricultural revolution, as one of the potential start dates. You could take the Industrial Revolution, because that's when humans really start pumping carbon into the atmosphere. You could even take 1950, the Great Acceleration, when the nuclear arms race is suddenly producing all new kinds of atmospheric pollution that's more obviously radioactive. And then there's the hypothesis that it begins in 1610. And this is the hypothesis known as the Orbis spike hypothesis. And this is the argument I subscribe to in my book. And this illustration, the orange line here, indicates CO2 levels, again, from the year 1000 over to 1600 and then into the future. And they call this the hockey stick graph sometimes, because obviously you can see that CO2 really shoot up there. But my question I wanted to ask everybody, why do you think 1610 would be a date where we see a decline in CO2, atmospheric CO2 levels? Does anybody have any ideas? What was going on in 1610? There was a plague, but
Was that an ice age?
Mini ice age. But
yeah, I mean, I think the River Thames froze over in 1666, I think. So there was probably some unseasonably cold weather.
was there a lot of deforestation?
Well, interestingly, not deforestation, but the opposite problem. Because what you have to kind of do here is look back here at like 1492, right? Columbus sails the ocean blue. And if you think about the devastation that Europeans caused to American Indian populations in North and South America over that 100-year time span between 1492 and 1610, Native Americans were what's known as a keystone species in their ecosystems, which means they're the ones who are kind of regulating doing population control of animals. They're also keeping, they're burning down the forests every year in certain parts of North America. Again, they're regulating things. And when that population of humans disappears so quickly and suddenly, what you see is actually a rise in O2 levels because you have plants growing that are suddenly not being tended by anybody. So this dip in CO2 is actually an increase in oxygen levels. And scientists have you can see this in the rock record because they took ice core samples in Antarctica, and they can look down to see where 1610 is, and there's more oxygen in that ice, I guess. So it's really interesting. And 1610 is also the year when our friend Shakespeare is writing some of his later plays. He's like almost done with his playwriting career. He's writing Cymbeline. It's also the same year the King James Bible is released. And so my take on the Anthropocene here is that human behaviors are responsible for global climate change, the Earth's 6th mass extinction event. There's a great book, I don't know if anybody's heard of Elizabeth Colbert, but she has written this great book about how human behaviors and really globalization is causing actively our 6th mass extinction event. And by human behavior specifically, I mean globalization inaugurated by the Columbian Exchange, by European settler colonialism, and by mass resource extraction in the primitive accumulation phase of capitalism. So basically when all this stuff from Europe is being brought over to the Americas, and you also have some things moving from the Americas over to Europe and Africa, right? It's almost like the two worlds between the Atlantic are suddenly kind of being eroded. So, my main claim, what does this have to do with Shakespeare? The thesis of my book is simple. The early modern stage laid the groundwork for what I want to call a theater of the Anthropocene, and this term might be broadly defined by 3 characteristics. So the first is that a theater of the Anthropocene regards performance as a fluctuation between human intention and unplanned accident in the context of European globalization. So again, I'm interested in this, like if you think about a play, putting on a play, plays involve human intention. They involve a rehearsal, right? But things also go wrong during performances all the time. But there are also ways in which the early modern theater is kind of thinking about accidents in a global context here. And I'm going to try to get through these first few just very quickly so I can talk about some stuff I think is maybe more interesting. But Bonduca is a play written not by Shakespeare, but by John Fletcher, who is actually one of Shakespeare's understudies as a playwright. He actually co-wrote a number of plays with Shakespeare, including Henry VIII, Two Noble Kinsmen. So he's kind of like coming up right as Shakespeare is sort of ending his career. And what's interesting about this play is it's a play about a queen's rebellion. A British queen is rebelling against the Roman Empire because it's set during the 1st century in Britain when Britain was a colonial subject of the Roman Empire. And, but it's interesting that it seems to also be commenting on what the British are trying to do in the Americas at that very moment. So it's sort of offering this kind of like heroic portrayal of a queen rebelling against a Roman oppressor at the same time that the British are sort of doing the same thing. So it's interesting for that reason. And it registers the role that disease and ecosystems play in sort of determining outcomes of colonial conquest. And this is a graphic. I actually got the chance to visit Colchester, England in January. It turns out my wife's family lives there. She has like 8 aunts and uncles who live there. And there's this fun little part in the museum where you can touch a button that says, "Do you think Bonduca was right to destroy Colchester?" So 57% said yes. This play, again, I'm going to kind of skip over this, but it makes use of this metaphors of grafting, which again is a gardening term. And it's really being used as sort of a metaphor to describe the process of transplanting one kind of, basically plants and food that grows in the Roman metropole and bringing it to Britain. And you have these Roman soldiers kind of complaining that like, oh, we really need all this stuff from back home in order to survive. So yeah, that's one way in which I see sort of this relationship between human intention and unplanned accident. Another tenet of this theater is that it upholds the unpredictability of live theater and makes room for ecological factors to influence the meaning of a given performance. So the second and third chapters of this book really focus on 3 commodities. Galls. Does anybody know what galls are? Have you ever heard that term? What is a gall?
They're diseases, I think, or some kind of organism that grows on leaves or on, you see them on tree trunks. They turn into these like big bubbles.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I had no idea what galls were before I started doing this, but it turns out they're actually part of an insect ecology where they're essentially like eggs for, this is a wasp's egg, essentially. It figures out a way to create this growth on a leaf, and then somehow the larva gets inside of there and then crawls out when it's mature. The thing about galls in the 16th century is that they're very useful because they were a primary ink ingredient. They were also used in blackface cosmetics, and so was burnt cork, which primarily grew on the Iberian Peninsula, like Portugal and Spain. So my argument in the second chapter here is that race on the early modern stage is a material, but it's also an environmental construction. White actors in blackface are depicting Moors like Othello, for example, but also Aaron in this other Shakespeare play called Titus Andronicus, which I think is a really fascinating play. And they make use of galls and corkwood to darken their white skin. Some other claims I'm making here are that skin color is also one of many markers of race in the 16th century. This is kind of a time before the slave trade tried to really solidify a distinction about what black skin indicated. And humans were also not seen as distinct from nature in the 16th century. So again, it's a very modern idea, this idea that like we're above nature somehow. But that idea was still kind of under construction in the 16th century. So in plays like Titus Andronicus, Lust's Dominion, you have these murderous Moor characters who are basically calling attention to the violence necessary for these modern ideologies of like white versus black or humans versus nature to emerge, essentially. And you can kind of see, I guess what I'm saying here is you can see it in the language of the play that these characters seem conscious that they're being constructed by these wooden ingredients. So Eleazar, who again is a Moor, says, if I digest this gall, which again is maybe, I'm suggesting is a pun on the material that might have been used to darken his skin. And in Titus Andronicus, it's a play where there's all kinds of hewing going on, if you've ever read it. It's a play where a woman gets her tongue cut out, her hands cut off, Titus gets his hand cut off, his sons get Chiron and Demetrius here, they end up baked into a pie, which Titus then feeds to their mother. So yeah, it's all kinds of salacious fun like that. But this is an interesting illustration because this is the only illustration of a Shakespeare play that was made during Shakespeare's lifetime, and it's of Titus Andronicus, and of course it also draws heavy attention to Aaron and his black skin. So it gives us a sense of kind of what this would have looked like when it was staged. In my third chapter, and what's interesting, I have to give AIC credit here because I never would have thought about this if I hadn't been at that UCC meeting where I learned that we were passing the cannabis program, because it made me wonder, like, well, what was cannabis doing in the 16th century? What was it doing on stage? Did the English know about it? How did it kind of fit into everything that was happening? And it turns out it's really interesting. Where I see it is it's sort of being, psychoactive cannabis is being conflated a lot of the time with hemp rope, right? They just called it hemp back then, but anything that you could smoke out of a pipe, they called tobacco, which included psychoactive cannabis. It also included some other psychoactive materials and even cocaine. So I can tell you more about that in the Q&A. But ladders of rope are really interesting to me in the agency they sort of have on stage. They're more than likely made of hemp, and they position hemp in a discourse that on the one hand resists globalization, but that ultimately contributes to the production of an early racial logic on the other. And ladders of rope show up in two Shakespeare's plays, Romeo and Juliet and The Two Gentlemen of Verona. And they're both used in these kind of wooing scenes. Hemp was an important commodity. It drove English commercial expansion. Just to give you a sense, it took about 90 tons of hemp or 450 acres to rig a single ship. So it's kind of like you could even pay your taxes in hemp back in the day. So it was a very important commodity. But it's interesting because in terms of how hemp is being conflated with tobacco, there's also a discussion about race that sort of emerges in the way that tobacco is also being advertised, but also sort of warned against. So in this particular image, you see how a Moor is depicted, amongst in affiliation with tobacco smoke, and people who were really against tobacco saw it as this thing that could really sort of impair white skin and Englishness. So they saw it as very threatening, at least some people did. So that's kind of what this quote is. Again, I can talk more about this. I just want to make sure I can kind of move along to the, I wanted to explain the title, what's on the cover of this book, this flock of starlings. European starlings, I think, are one of the most interesting aspects of how ecology and Shakespearean studies kind of intersect. And it's because European starlings, which, you can go out onto the campus quad and see European starlings, they're not supposed to be in this country. That's why they're called European starlings. They're an invasive species. The reason they're in this country is technically because of Shakespeare. There was a guy in 1890 named Eugene Schifflin who had this idea. He said, I want to introduce into Central Park all of the birds that are mentioned in Shakespeare's plays, including the starling. And he released them all like on a very cold day in April, and most of them died immediately. The starlings somehow made it, and cut to a couple centuries later, they're one of the most prolific birds in America. Starlings are mentioned only once in Shakespeare. It's in Henry IV, Part 1. Hotspur is asking Henry IV to release his uncle, who is an heir to the throne, to release him for ransom. The king says, no, I don't want to hear another word about your Uncle Mortimer. And then when the king walks away, Hotspur says, I'll have a starling shall be taught to speak nothing but Mortimer, and give it to him, and give it him to keep his anger still in motion. And what he's referring to here is the fact that a starling is actually a mimic. Like a parrot, a starling can imitate the sounds of human speech. It can imitate the sounds of chainsaws. It can imitate lots of urban city sounds. And what's interesting about this to me is that, again, starlings very well may have contributed to the extinction event of, say, the carrier pigeon, right? They're introduced into an environment where they have no natural predators, they outcompete other birds, and they sort of contribute to this extinction event that we're seeing. One of the most interesting ways, so the other thing I'm trying to do in this book is look at how Shakespeare himself actually contributed to or how Shakespeare himself as a commodity sort of contributed to a changing sense of the global environment, I guess. So in my fourth chapter, I argue that actors and actresses who performed Shakespeare on the colonial stages of the British Empire basically saw themselves as martyrs for the bard. Like they were really gung-ho about taking Shakespeare everywhere they could, but it's because of the copious environmental risks that they encountered. I argue that Shakespeare's cultural iconicity is owed in part to the way Shakespearean actors encountered the environments of the British Empire. So one most recent example of this is Dominic Dromgoole, who wrote a book in 2017 called Hamlet Globe to Globe, 2 years, 190,000 miles, 197 countries, one play. That play, of course, was Hamlet. And he talks about sort of encountering like a windstorm in a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. And again, the sentiment behind his take on this performance is that like we had to perform Shakespeare, we had to perform Hamlet in this particular environment. And he's really echoing a whole line of actors who have done a very similar thing before him in this kind of colonial project of taking Shakespeare to the British Empire. Daniel E. Bandman toured all over Australia, New Zealand, India, China, with a lot of different Shakespeare plays. He traveled 70,000 miles in 3.5 years, giving 700 performances. This isn't so much an environmental encounter, but it's one thing I'm interested in. He really shows how, he's taking Shakespeare to these different places of the world where there are cannibals, right, outside of Port Darwin, Australia. I have a whole nother book I could write about cannibals. I won't get into that right now. But he does say, like, it is not seldom that a child falls victim to their ferocity and brutal tastes, right? He's sort of showing, like, but I still had to take Shakespeare here. It was important, right? Alan Wilkie toured Asia from 1911 to 1913. His Australian Shakespeare company was a 10-year stint all over Australia and New Zealand. He tries to perform all of Shakespeare's 37 plays, but he only succeeds in performing 27, but he still performs quite a few. But he has my favorite example of kind of how, like, what can actually happen during a performance of a Shakespeare play. So he's in Calcutta at the Grand Opera House, and his wife is playing Portia in The Merchant of Venice. And there's a famous speech in The Merchant of Venice called The Quality of Mercy. Quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. As Portia is delivering these lines, a monkey from the rafters takes a wrench somehow that it found, and threw it at her head and narrowly missed her, right? And this is Wilkie's response. He says, I considered that whatever again, talking about the monkeys, whatever their opinion of her performance, they should at least have some respect for the immortal William. If that was all they thought of mercy, I would have none, and very reluctantly I had one of them shot. When the others, realizing with Falstaff that discretion was the better part of valor, quickly disappeared to another, and I trust more suitable roosting place. So, yeah, I'm fascinated by all these instances where nature sort of intersects with Shakespearean performance. Jeffrey Kendall's another example of this, who toured all over India, sort of before and then after India declared independence in 1947. He has this is not unique to India itself, but there are several instances of outdoor performances of Shakespeare where actors talk about I wish Frank was here because I wonder if he has examples of this from his own career, but Kendall says, if you played out of doors, tiny insects would creep under your wig and mosquitoes would nibble at your ankles. We would make our exits calmly, then once out of sight of the audience, fall into a frenzy of scratching. At an alfresco evening, all the moths and mosquitoes of the area converged on our stage lights and then turned their attention to us. So, and he talks about how difficult it is to play dead. Like if you have to play dead in a play and then you're being bitten by mosquitoes, it affects what happens on stage. I mean, Genevieve Ward is another example who talks about in Johannesburg, one night I felt a great rumbling under my pillow, rats. She also talks about performing with influenza. She had a fever, but she's still like running out on stage. I wore 2 fur coats in the wings while everyone else was melting with the heat, yet I shivered during the whole performance. And again, she's on a 9-month tour of South Africa. I think that was in Johannesburg. Matheson Lang's another person who tours South Africa, India, China, and Malaysia with a Shakespearean repertoire. Talks about encountering tarantulas when he's playing Petruchio. Frank Benson and Cedric Hardwick, also touring South Africa. They have this sort of funny anecdote about how it was so hot in Peter Maritzburg that when they wanted to play Merry Wives of Windsor, which again features Falstaff, who's the fat knight, and usually involves some kind of padding to show a kind of beer belly. Nobody wanted to wear the beer belly. Nobody wanted to wear the padding because it was so hot. And again, their thesis here is that no matter what the conditions, Shakespeare triumphed. So again, it's this very sort of pro-imperial agenda that's being furthered here, but the climate, I'm trying to suggest that the environment is actually what's kind of contributing to the apotheosis of Shakespeare, the increasing of his cultural status. In chapter 5, I turn to the weather, and specifically how weather events intersect with outdoor Shakespearean performances. And this happens all the time because if you ever go to a Shakespeare summer festival, there are outdoor performances all the time, especially like in New York, for example. I want to preface this by saying I know that weather is not the same thing as climate. I know that snow in April does not mean that global warming is a hoax. But there is a way you can talk about weather and climate in the same, and climate change specifically in the same breath because of this kind of emerging science called weather event attribution science, which basically studies a causal link between human behaviors and weather event intensification. And this is really an effort to kind of hold CO2 offending nations responsible for emitting CO2, essentially. And this is also where we get to one of the problems with the thesis of the Anthropocene, right? If the Anthropocene narrative says that the human species is responsible for climate change, that means that all of us in this room are equally responsible, right? It means that everybody in America is just as responsible as everybody in, every other country in the world, right? Which I have problems with if you consider the history of European colonialism, right? Do all humans contribute to climate change equally? Is it fair to say that the human species possesses this geologic agency? I want to say no. Attribution science is essentially, again, calling into question whether when we see a huge hurricane, a category 4 or 5, hit Puerto Rico, is that Mother Nature or can that be attributed to human beings somehow? Same with flooding events, and it poses this question of whether humans are culpable for floods. What I think is interesting is that this is actually, even though it seems like a very new idea, it's actually a very old idea because the early modern English thought about human behaviors influencing weather all the time. So what caused floods in early modern England? Well, it was human behaviors. Here's a pamphlet that was written about a flood in Wales, and I like these because they have the illustration of like the cows and the people, and it's all very sad. But if you look at it, it says, pride and gluttony and like human sin and vices are this is why God is punishing us with this flood, right? Here's another one, the lamentable tempestuous winds and weather, where it's sort of holding accountable millions of varieties of transgressions. We seem to batter the glorious frame of heaven, right? And this one has even little devils sort of tearing down the churches. And of course, my favorite, you get the little boys with the full cheeks kind of blowing, and another flood. And again, this one is sort of suggesting that, well, it's actually wealth inequality that's maybe contributing. The spoils of stately houses, the great turrets of great personages, right? These are the offenses. This is why there's a flooding event happening. So the question I want to ask about, the question I want to ask about weather events and what happens when they intersect with Shakespearean performances is what happens specifically if we're talking about a play that is staging the weather deliberately, and also what happens if we're still in the colonial context. So again, I'm trying to imagine what audience members at a play in Hamilton, Bermuda in 1950, for example, would have seen when they go to see The Tempest. And again, Bermuda is still technically a British colony, even in 1950. And the play, The Tempest, if you don't know, is traditionally read as kind of a metaphor for colonialism. You have Prospero, this European guy who shows up on this island with his daughter, and he also has magical powers. He can control the weather, but there are also already people living. There's really one guy living on the island already, Caliban. So it's kind of about Prospero taking over the island and ruling Caliban with his power. And right, Caliban is afraid of Prospero. He says, I must obey. His art is of such power, it would control my damned god Setebos and make a vassal of him. But my question is, what happens when you watch this play that opens with a tempest? It opens with a storm at sea, and what happens if Prospero doesn't actually have control over that storm? What happens if he calls for the winds to stop and the winds don't stop, right? Does he still kind of have that control? And I guess I'm interested in this because it kind of suggests that this play, which can have a very pro-colonial agenda, can actually sort of read as a more kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial play in that matter, given just when the storm kind of hits the play or enters at the wrong time. Another example of this, I found another performance, this time of Romeo and Juliet in Cape Town, South Africa in 1892, where again, the rain forces, it created such a hullabaloo that Romeo and Juliet had to shout at one another, the scenery sagged from the roof, and the dresses produced the contortions of a Javanese dancer, yet there was also praise when Mrs. Potter came to the closing tragic scene. What's interesting to me about this particular performance and the rain intersecting with Romeo and Juliet is that in 1892, the audience would primarily have been made up of gold miners, because there was a gold rush happening in the 1890s in Cape Town. And there was also this brand new process of basically gold mining where they would extract earth they would basically dig down into the earth and spray the earth with potassium cyanide, which of course makes the gold easier to extract, but has these side effects where it's not only going to get into the groundwater, it's also, if it gets dry enough, it's going to create poisonous dust, right? There are other side effects of doing gold mining this way, like acid mine drainage, where if you just leave mines open for long enough and rainwater gets in, eventually the rainwater will oxidize the pyrite, which is a kind of mineral, and it'll basically produce sulfuric acid, which can also get into the groundwater. So there's all kinds of negative side effects with mining this way. But in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, there's this very important scene where Romeo purchases poison from an apothecary, which is what he uses to commit suicide. And when he pays the apothecary for it, he says, "There is thy gold, worst poison to men's souls. doing more murder in this loathsome world than these poor compounds that thou mayest not sell. I sell thee poison, thou hast sold me none. Right? So Romeo is able to identify a link between poison and gold in this play that I think the rain only kind of accentuates in an outdoor performance. So again, I'm really interested in how the weather and how these non-human things have agency on stage, and how they can help us to kind of think about our agency in the Anthropocene in a different way. And my answer to this is that the Shakespearean stage can actually help us, what I call provincialize the Anthropocene, and to think about that agency that we possess, not as something that's shared between all of us, that we all share equally, but that works more like when we're in a playhouse and the actor on stage has agency over a scene, but how the audience also gets to interact with that actor, and how the stuff on stage might also be influencing the performance somehow. My last chapter, I'm going to try to skip ahead here just to leave time for some questions. The last thing I'm trying to point out with this theater of the Anthropocene is that a good deal of early modern drama can offer strategies for confronting ecological crises that can be useful to modern audiences who are also confronting a rapidly changing global environment. So people always ask me what my favorite Shakespeare play is, what my favorite speech is. I think I have to go with King Lear for a couple reasons. I mean, this is a play, it's a very powerful play about, again, I read it as a play about wealth redistribution, but it's also a play that's kind of about water redistribution and nature finding its balance in really interesting ways. My favorite speech from this play is when Lear, who has been cast out by his daughters into a storm, is sort of walking around with a fool and encounters poverty and sort of misery in a way that he's never had to experience, right? He's the king. But here he finds himself in a storm, literally without a roof over his head, and he ends up shouting to the heavens, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? I have taken too little care of this. Take physic pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just." And a superflux, by the way, is an excess of water. And the other thing that happens in this play is while you have Lear kind of experiencing this epiphany about his wealth in the storm, you also have his counterpart, Gloucester, who has also been betrayed by his children, one of his sons anyway, and has also been blinded by Lear's daughters. So he's blind, and he's basically suicidal, and he asks a stranger who turns out is his own son, who's pretending to be somebody he isn't. He asks him to take me to the cliffs of Dover, right? To a place where I shall no leading need, right? Because he wants to jump off. But he's also very conscious that he wants to sort of redistribute his wealth. He says he hopes that distribution should undo excess and each man have enough. And I guess my question was like, why does Shakespeare want to put the cliffs of Dover in this play and sort of stage this as a scene of like economic redistribution? And what I found is, again, sort of engaging a little bit more with the deep time scale of this play that I think is interesting. There's a guy, Richard Verstegen, who wrote a book right around the time Shakespeare wrote King Lear called A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence in Antiquities. And he essentially theorizes that there used to be a land bridge between France and England, and that the cliffs of Dover are kind of the residue of that land bridge. Like it was an isthmus that basically got bulldozed by a flooding event. And Verstegen says that the water on one side of the land bridge was probably higher than on the other side, and that it pushed the land over, and then there was an equilibrium between the two sides. And it turns out scientists have kind of recently figured out that he's right. There's evidence of an ancient flooding event destroying this kind of isthmus between France and England, and yeah, and it's also a place where there are a lot of not hurricanes, God, earthquakes. Sorry. So I was also looking at kind of, in addition to hurricanes, earthquakes in this play. But again, what I think is really interesting is that Shakespeare seems conscious of the fact that that there's an opportunity for the water to kind of find balance and to redistribute itself, and that that's sort of being used as kind of a model for economic redistribution in this play, which I think is really powerful and speaks to the, I guess, the importance of the White Cliffs of Dover in that particular play. So anyway, this book was fun to write. It was a long undertaking. It was my dissertation that sort of got transformed a little bit. But that's pretty much what I wanted to share, and I'm open to any questions people might have.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Lori.
I can remember in my youthful days as an English major writing a long paper about the uses of water in Shakespeare plays. But the focus that I was taught to use was that it had to do with baptism, religious symbolism. So I wondered if you'd come across any of that, like the weather, the baptism.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of those pamphlets about like heavy weather events, there is a lot of language about, kind of being baptized in fire. It's this very fire and brimstone type of language. But yeah,
Also renewal.
yeah, like, right.
Water in the tempest renews all the people at the end.
Right. And one thing I found in writing about King Lear actually is that Lear, that play is actually kind of borrowing from medieval, what were called, what is it? The mystery cycle plays, where they would basically tell the story from like the beginning of the earth to Christ's resurrection. And one of the series of plays that they would stage was actually the Noah's Ark play. And there are scenes in the Lear storm scenes are actually, I think, borrowing really heavily from some of those early mystery cycle plays. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting connection.
I'm just curious, have you worked with or spoken to Shakespeare companies that do outdoor performances?
I mean, I relied a little bit on my own experience. I don't know if anybody has ever seen like the Hampshire Shakespeare Company, who perform sometimes like up in like the Five College area, Amherst. But I went to a play one time in July. It was an evening performance of The Winter's Tale. And there's a line in that play where Leontes has to say like, too hot, too hot. And he's talking about like his wife's basically feelings for this guy that he's jealous over, and he's sort of having a moment where he's being very jealous of his best friend. But the actor who said the line, it was like 90 degrees, and he was like pouring sweat, and he was like too hot, and he kind of looked at the audience and made this knowing gesture. And yeah, I mean, I've actually never seen a Shakespeare play at like the Delacorte in New York City, where they do Shakespeare in the Park. But I found a ton of newspaper articles that talk about like the weather intersecting in really like clever ways.
Shakespeare and Company, I don't know if they still do this, but before they moved Stockbridge, they used to be in Lenox at what is at the Edith Wharton House.
Yeah,
And when they would do Midsummer Night's Dream, they did a lot of plays outdoors.
yeah.
They would be right out there in the trees. And so they seem to be a company that really was into it.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, no, I would really like to explore that a little bit more. And I think more companies are kind of aware of even like deliberately trying to stage performances that engage with the environment and then engage with notions of a changing climate a lot more deliberately.
companies would probably appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's a good idea.
Right
Yeah, Matthew.
As I was listening to your talk, and especially when you gave these examples of lines, famous lines from Shakespeare's plays being potentially taking on another meaning in a storm, for example, playing the Tempest, but there's an actual hurricane raging outside,
Yeah.
stuff like that. It made me think of an essay by the philosopher Shakespearean Stage called Signature Event Context.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, he talks about a lot of things in that essay, but one thing he talks about is how writing can never stand on its own. It never really holds its own meaning. It always has to take its meaning from a context around it, and that context is never stable.
Yeah.
And so as I was listening to that, it relates in a way to what Lori was asking about, I think, about different interpretations, like past ones, is, on one hand, it's very interesting, you're bringing up ways in which the Anthropocene, this moment in history, might force us to read moments in Shakespeare differently.
Yeah.
That's one idea that came across to me. At the same time, I'm thinking, how does those sorts of readings actually, and the recontextualization of Shakespeare, reveal something about reading as such, or how the Anthropocene becomes its own context of reading things and interpreting signs in a certain way.
Huh.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, you mean how can like the Anthropocene maybe be a lens or like a theoretical approach to reading?
Well,
Or
even just the idea that when these things take up resonance suddenly, like lines from the Tempest in this moment, that what it suggests about how we're keen to read certain things now in the Anthropocene. Like that, our attention is now focused. There are certain things that resonate differently than in the past or take on this new meaning. And how that's, a lens of a much larger lens.
Yeah.
Being read, not just Shakespeare.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing I'll say in response, I know that Shakespeare, there are scholars who will say, well, we can't even talk about performance because we weren't there in the Cape Town performance. We're all just speculating, or I'm speculating about what might have happened or how people would have interpreted something. And that we have to kind of stick to the text because that's all we have, right? But I think Shakespeare was a playwright and meant for his words to be performed. But I also think one thing that's helpful to kind of think, and I was sort of anticipating a lot of criticism from Shakespeare scholars in the publication process of this, which is one reason, again, I was kind of surprised, like, really? Nobody's going to push back? But because one thing a lot of Shakespeare scholars like to point out is like, oh, you're being anachronistic. Like, you can't talk about climate change and Shakespeare because Shakespeare didn't know about it. That's you're projecting back into the past. But I think one thing I'm trying to emphasize in my book is that living in the Anthropocene actually means inhabiting anachronism. Like the seas used to be as high as they're gonna be in 100 years. It just hasn't been that way for millions of years, right? There aren't supposed to be starlings in North America, but there are, right? We're learning to adapt in this world that, I mean, you could even argue that COVID-19 is kind of a symptom of, I don't want to step outside my bounds here, but like COVID-19 sort of, again, maybe was caused because of these like people and animals being put into context where they had never been next to each other before. So I think, it is kind of a strategy maybe for reading and for seeing, but also I think we kind of have to learn to live our lives in a sort of a different way, given our knowledge of the changing climate.
Sure.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
My point wasn't about anachronism. I'm compelled by your readings of these things. I was interested in this other side.
Yeah.
It's a kind of complement to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Answer it.
thank you for the question.
Book number 2, Will?
Oh,
Sure.
I don't know. Yeah, I have an idea. I mean, I was just at SAA, the Shakespeare Association of America, last 2 weeks ago, and got invited to another conference where I proposed a paper about nuclear Shakespeares. But that's as far as I got. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, so we'll see. But yeah, maybe that's next.
I remember going to a Shakespeare play in Jamaica Plain, and it was there's a Jamaica Pond, and there's like a little outdoor theater there. And it was in the summer, and it was hot, and there were mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And I think that's all I remember. Like, that's what I
Right, you don't remember the play? Yeah.
I just remember it was hot, there were mosquitoes, and
Yeah.
I don't know why I wanted to go to an outdoor. That's all. That's what I took away.
Yeah. No, I mean, I found info about a performance that was like designed where it's one of these walking tours where you walk all over the park and then suddenly you'll see, oh, here's the murder of Duncan, or I guess it was Hamlet, so here's the murder of Claudius. But then the actress who had to play like Ophelia was like running back and forth between the woods because she had to be at a scene over there where the audience had to be in like the next 5 minutes. So yeah, like productions like that exist and they are really interesting. But yeah, I also get it that being outside, and I guess the last thing I'll say here is the thing that really interested me is like, yeah, if you're watching a play and you're just being eaten by mosquitoes, I'm trying to imagine how a colonial audience would have felt. Like these British people show up, they want to show us this Shakespeare play because they think Shakespeare's like the bee's knees. But meanwhile, we're just being bitten by mosquitoes and being forced to sit here out at night. Is that actually elevating Shakespeare's cultural superiority? Or
Catching malaria, perhaps.
yeah, exactly. So
I appreciate what you said about the view of weather and that it is somehow our actions that influence the weather. And I don't know how much that was accepted, but we're at a time, I just am thinking of this as a vehicle for teaching too.
yeah,
Using Shakespeare to teach about this, but we're at a time now where we know
yeah,
how we affect the weather, and people are in denial.
right,
And that's just very interesting to me, that there was a time where they didn't have the knowledge, and they thought for reasons that are really not scientific, that
Right.
their actions produced these consequences. And
Yeah.
we're at a time where we do know, but people
yeah.
don't take
It still comes down to like belief, right, or belief in science, or which
our relationship to nature changed so
Yeah.
much that now we could do something about it.
right,
And as opposed to just say, this is fate, this
Right.
this is God doing this. to
right,
us.
exactly,
We could do something, but
yeah, yeah, and that's what we have to figure out. So, well, anyway, I'm really grateful for you guys for coming. So, thank you. Yeah, thank you.